One Piece has countless iconic story arcs that string together to make one epic masterpiece. And while I've talked about each One Piece arc's greatest strength in the past, there's no such thing as perfect. And even the best One Piece arcs have some small area in which they could be better. So what is the one weakness of each arc? What's the one area where each storyline could be improved? I'm going to go through the whole story from Romance Dawn all the way to Elbaf and make a case for the biggest weakness of each storyline. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe. And have you ever wanted a deck of One Piece playing cards? That's right, you can get an entire 52 card deck with all of One Piece's most iconic characters represented by different cards, from the King of Spades all the way to the Two of Diamonds. We've even got the Jokers. Find out which card your favorite character is, and the best part is, if you buy 2 character posters from our Legends collection, you can get another 2 posters plus the deck of cards free. This deal goes away at the end of the month, so make sure you get your deal on playing cards by hitting the link in the description below. Romance Dawn has very simple storytelling, which is no problem for the first arc in the story, but something that definitely doesn't hold up well is specifically the overly simple dialogue. The dialogue feels downright childish in the first few chapters of One Piece, almost as though it's like a kid's storybook rather than the start of the greatest epic of modern times. While Shonen Jump is aimed at schoolboys, even by shonen manga standards and the standards of the rest of One Piece, the way characters talk in Romance Dawn just feels a bit too basic. But luckily, this noticeably improves very rapidly as East Blue progresses. Shellstown is the first time we get one of One Piece's storytelling staples, the Straw Hat backstory. Except Zoro's flashback is maybe the weakest one we could have gotten to kick things off with. Before Oda became a backstory god, he gave us Kuina falling down the stairs off screen, which to date is one of the most rushed and least emotionally moving flashbacks we've ever gotten in the series. Especially surprising considering Zoro is the first and most prominent of Luffy's crewmates. Orangetown is a largely inoffensive arc, but the battle between Luffy and Buggy stands out as a somewhat underwhelming debut of Devil Fruits as a power system. Most shonen manga aim to sell readers on their unique power system early in the story, and Oda repeatedly builds up just how special, rare, and powerful these Devil Fruit abilities are right away. As such, there is a good deal of anticipation for the first match between 2 Devil Fruit users that we have to wait 20 chapters to get to. And when we get it, it's, well, very dull. Especially at a point where One Piece was having to compete with power systems like ninjutsu and zanpakuto that featured truly mesmerizing battles and abilities, Luffy and Buggy's awkwardly choreographed and ultimately comical showdown does not paint a particularly exciting picture for new One Piece readers as to the appeal of this series' power system. And it doesn't help that this remains the only showcase of a fight between Devil Fruit users that we get for a long time. Syrup Village doesn't have a real weakness beyond not doing quite as much for Usopp as it potentially could have. Since Usopp inherently carries a lot more negative traits compared to the other Straw Hats, being a liar and a coward, I would argue that there is more heavy lifting required to make the reader embrace him as a Straw Hat in his introductory arc. And while Syrup Village ultimately does show that Usopp is capable of being brave, it's not really until Arlong Park that we get to truly see and appreciate the depth of this character's resolve. As in Syrup Village, Usopp is largely carried by the other Straw Hats throughout the conflict. Baratie's biggest weakness is also its greatest strength. See, the main Baratie plotline is strong as is. Sanji and Zeph's relationship is great, Jin is the most interesting enemy we've encountered so far, Luffy vs. Krieg is a genuinely high-stakes fight, but this whole plot is ultimately overshadowed by the Zoro vs. Mihawk detour, which completely steals the show. This is not so much a weakness as much as a narrative structure choice that inherently makes the middle section of this arc significantly more exciting than the rest of the arc, even if the rest is still very good. I feel like most of One Piece's best arcs reach their high points towards the end, so Baratie is a notable exception, even if it is completely understandable why Oda made this narrative choice. Arlong Park is a damn near perfect storyline. If I had to find one area that it could arguably improve, then from a modern 2026 perspective, considering that Oda does often have a penchant towards writing women as damsels in distress, and decades ago this was even more prominent in his writing, I think in retrospect, Nami could maybe have been allowed to contribute in some minor way to the resolution of the conflict. Now, to be fair, the point of her storyline was to finally allow others to help her, rather than shouldering everything on her own, so Nami standing in the sidelines technically thematically makes sense, but at the same time it can feel a little weird seeing her let the boys do everything for her, especially considering Nami should be at least more capable than Usopp, who only just stepped outside his safe little village for the first time. It could arguably be nice if Oda had found a way to give Nami a bit more agency in some way without contradicting her growth, of course, though maybe that take is too progressive and the arc is perfectly fine as is. Loguetown should have kept the Daddy Masterson storyline. That's all. I completely get why Oda wanted to get to the Grand Line by chapter 100, and therefore cut Daddy Masterson. And in all honesty, Loguetown works great as a quick set of 10 out of 10 chapters back to back to back, but the Daddy Masterson duel with Usopp would have been another great segment that would have fit in seamlessly with the rest of Loguetown. And it was just so good for Usopp's character in general, as another connection to Usopp's broader journey of following in his father's footsteps. At least we got this in the anime. Reverse Mountain is the only One Piece storyline with no real conflict. Even Zoe at least has the looming threat of Jack, whereas Reverse Mountain basically just has the vague problem of Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday and a short backstory for Laboon. This is maybe the most uneventful arc in the story, which is at least somewhat forgivable as it is also one of the shortest arcs in the story. Unlike Reverse Mountain, Whiskey Peak feels like the true exciting start to the Grand Line that readers hoped for, with the revelation of Baroque works, the battle against the 100 bounty hunters, the start of a plotline to save an entire kingdom, and a tease of a Shichibukai in the future. But the one glaring flaw in this arc is the absurdly out-of-character duel between Luffy and Zoro. After so many emotional storylines in East Blue that establish the unbreakable bonds between the Straw Hats and the absolute trust that Luffy has in his crew, it feels extremely forced that Luffy would rather believe a random person he just met over his Nakama. And it's especially contradictory considering the whole point of Luffy's first storyline with Zoro in particular was that Luffy chose not to believe all the terrible rumors that everyone said about Zoro, and Luffy instead chose to judge Zoro through his own interactions with him. Now, some say that this is just a gag fight, but just because the fight is resolved with a gag does not change the fact that it's made extremely painfully clear that Luffy and Zoro are both genuinely serious about their duel. The sad part is that Oda could have easily found a different reason to make them fight, as the one part that is believable about this is that inside they both sincerely want to find out who is stronger. As Conqueror's Haki users, that is inherently in their nature. But Oda choosing to make the reason for the fight that Luffy blindly believes a stranger rather than trusting Zoro is the worst possible trigger he could have come up with. Little Garden is often viewed as one of One Piece's least exciting arcs, which I think comes down to Little Garden having a very transitional feel. Despite the fact that Mr. 3 does actually get close to killing the Straw Hats, he is generally portrayed as a bit more of a comical villain, which is a constant subconscious reminder to the reader that no matter how bad things get, nothing too serious is actually going to happen here. And on top of that, once pretty much all the Straw Hats except Usopp and Luffy are taken out of commission, it becomes a bit too obvious that this is mostly just an arc for Usopp to get some character moments. Combined with the fact that we know that this arc is just build up for Alabasta, Little Garden can feel at points like an arc that we need to simply get through to get to the big stuff. Drum Kingdom is a masterclass in emotional storytelling. Even though it's a complete diversion from the building Baroque works plot, Drum Kingdom proves that a storyline does not need to be high stakes as long as it's well written. However, while Chopper's backstory is One Piece at its best, the rest of the arc is defined by Wapol, who is one of the least exciting arc villains in One Piece history. He is annoying, incompetent, stupid, and weak, an East Blue level villain who we still have to deal with in the Grand Line. And his henchmen are also the worst henchmen of any villain so far. Now, not every arc needs a strong villain, and part of the point is that Wapol is weak, but even if that's the point, it doesn't change the fact that the final fight of the arc feels like an obligatory task to check off, rather than a climactic finish. Pell. Nothing else needs to be said. Quick quiz, do you know the name of these two characters? My guess is 99% of One Piece readers don't, because they kind of sucked. Oda usually knocks it out of the park with comic side characters and arcs, but Mashira and Shoujo are no Johnny and Yasaku. I think the fact that these two were active hindrances to the Straw Hats early in the storyline that stalled the plot multiple times for no real reason prevents them from being as beloved. But they really are the only weak points of an otherwise flawless arc. Skypiea is appreciated today largely because of hindsight. We now recognize that Skypiea had significant lore reveals, but when experiencing Skypiea for the first time, a lot of readers or viewers get bored. There's even a subsection of the One Piece community known as Skypiea skippers. However, this makes sense, as while Skypiea is one of the longest One Piece arcs, it lacks most of the elements that make One Piece's longer arcs engaging. Besides the very end when we get Enel's shocked face and the Noland and Kolgara flashback, the first 80% of Skypiea generally lacks iconic moments, exciting plot twists, great fights, or dramatic scenes for the Straw Hats. With most longer One Piece arcs, there tend to be a lot of story beats that are memorable. For example, in Alabasta, which is actually shorter than Skypiea, we had Ace's introduction, the Mr. Prince sequence, Luffy vs. Crocodile in the desert, the Baroque Works fights, the Poneglyph and ancient weapon reveals, and of course the iconic finale. And you can make a similar list of notable plot beats throughout most of One Piece's longer arcs, whereas Skypiea is kind of just One Piece going through the motions until the very ending stretch. I'd wager most readers would struggle right now to recall the actual full plot of Skypiea without a refresher. Surprisingly, I believe the only weakness of Long Ring Longland is its placement. There's no point in critiquing it for being a lighter, lower stakes, comedy-focused arc, as that's what it aims to be, and it's enjoyable when viewed through that framework. However, the problem is that this arc comes right after Skypiea, which already felt like a very long side quest. And so to then follow that lengthy side quest up immediately with Long Ring Longland, which feels like filler, gives the reader the sense that the stretch between the end of Jaya all the way to the start of Water 7 is a very, very long window where it feels like the actual plot of One Piece doesn't progress. I often refer to this window in One Piece as the hump when it comes to new readers and viewers. Anyone who can get past this hump to Water 7 is generally hooked for life. Remember when I said that no arc in One Piece is perfect? Well, I tried, I really did, but I cannot think of one thing wrong with the Water 7 Enies Lobby storyline. If you have a critique, then please let me know in the comments below, but in my eyes, there is genuinely nothing that could be improved. I think Thriller Bark features the best Straw Hat team battle ever, but the individual one-on-one battles for the Straw Hats leave a lot to be desired, which would not normally be an issue if not for the fact that this is the final arc for the Straw Hats to get one-on-one fights till the post-time skip. This is the last round of fights for our main characters for the next several hundred chapters. And in that light, well, only Usopp vs. Perona is actually good, Zoro vs. Ryuma is solid, and beyond that, Sanji vs. Absalom is a joke, Luffy vs. Moria is one of Luffy's most forgettable fights in the story, and I genuinely think most readers don't even remember that Chopper and Robin vs. Hogback happened. Not exactly the best lineup to close out the entire pre-time skip. I really struggled to think of anything for this perfect run of chapters, but I did realize one tiny issue. Oda has explained that he did not originally plan the supernovas. He came up with the concept last minute at the request of his editor to make Sabaody more exciting. And this is actually observable when rereading Sabaody, as there are inconsistencies in how the supernova are written in Sabaody compared to how Oda actually decided to write their characters for real later on. Law is portrayed as a lot more edgy and antagonistic here than he later turns out to be. Kid is written to be far more philosophical and reflective than he is in the post-time skip, where he is basically dumb and simple-minded. Capone Beige is very violent and cruel to subordinates, even though post-time skip he is actually written to be very protective and caring towards them. These subtle differences make sense, as Oda did not have time to think exactly how he wanted to write and use these characters in the future, and so it seems he subtly altered their concepts later. Amazon Lily is simply One Piece playing to its most cringe humor. In general, the arc is filled with dick jokes, ball jokes, women are from Venus, men are from Mars jokes, etc. It's funny for kids, which to be completely fair is the demographic One Piece is catered to, but it is kind of eye-rolling for older readers, especially in the middle of the high-stakes plot of the Summit War saga. One could argue that Bon Clay getting away without any consequence at the end of the arc is a little questionable. I don't consider the Bon Clay situation to be like Pell, where Oda clearly wrote a death scene and then walked it back. But the fact that Bon Clay gets off completely scot-free from a poison man and is partying it up in New Kamaland after this tragic quote-unquote sacrifice is the only slightly questionable part about Impel Down. I mean, Luffy was only saved thanks to Ivankov, so how was Bon Clay saved? But again, Oda didn't actually write a full death scene here, so I don't really mind it. I don't know if Marineford has any weaknesses. If I had to stretch, I'd say maybe the believability of the war could be slightly improved in hindsight, as in retrospect from today's perspective, the Marine side really should have completely crushed the Whitebeard Pirates side in the first 5 minutes or so, but hey, it made for good drama at the time. I love everything about Post-Marineford except for surprisingly the central flashback. The Luffy Ace Sabo flashback is obviously important, it gives us some good context for Luffy's past, but it's ultimately not that sad or emotional in my opinion as far as flashbacks go. Oda practically spells out from the start that Sabo survived, which I think gently softens the loss of Ace in the modern day a bit by establishing that we can expect a replacement brother to show up pretty soon. I also love Return to Sabaody, but in retrospect, I think this would have been a good opportunity for a more elaborate Straw Hat reunion. And I imagine most others, did not mind at all on the first read-through that the reunion is fast. We want to get the story rolling, of course, and as Luffy says, there will be plenty of time for the Straw Hats to commiserate over their experiences and have deep interactions after they get on the road again. But as the post-time skip progresses and it becomes very apparent that Oda is never going to write a scene of the crew genuinely delving into the emotions of their traumatizing separation, their 2-year time skip, and subsequent reunion, in retrospect, I feel like Return to Sabaody was the best opportunity for some of those interactions to happen. Fishman Island is already generally viewed as one of the weaker One Piece arcs with the worst batch of villains in the series, but the biggest weakness in my opinion that tops it all off is Sanji's nosebleed scene. It's essentially taking the worst, least funny, most cringeworthy gag in the story and not even allowing us to ignore it, but rather putting it up front and center and turning it into an actual quote-unquote dramatic plot point that in my opinion is an all-time low moment for One Piece in general. Punk Hazard was an arc about cardio. Oda had the Straw Hats running all over the island to the point that they literally got tired of running. The problem was that between the Straw Hats, Law, and Smoker, the protagonists overall are way too strong for the trio of villains on Punk Hazard, which means that chemical warfare has to become the main threat. But that's not exactly fun to watch the heroes deal with since there's nothing to be done about it besides running all over the island and then running through the lab. Dressrosa's pacing can be rough, even on a binge read. Dressrosa is the second longest One Piece arc of all time, ahead of Whole Cake Island, Skypiea, Alabasta, and so on. But unlike all these other storylines that take place over multiple days in expansive settings, Dressrosa is 100 chapters crammed into a single afternoon in one of the smallest nations the Straw Hats have ever visited. There are just so many new characters, so many factions, so many narrative threads, so many backstories that Oda aims to stuff into this single afternoon that the actual progression of the plot slows to a crawl, particularly after the birdcage, with many transitional chapters dedicated just to positioning all the heroes on the right level of the plateau before the fights can actually begin. Now, I don't know if you'd call this a weakness, but the only thing that's slightly off to me about Zou is that Raizo himself is kind of lame. After the absolutely beautiful reveal of Raizo Dono is safe, an all-time One Piece classic moment, there is just the slightest bit of anticlimax for me personally when we actually get to meet this friend that the entire civilization suffered through hell for. And he turns out to be a rather disappointing ninja who is quickly shunted to the background and ultimately goes down as maybe the least interesting of the scabbards in the end. A common sentiment during the Whole Cake Island arc was that if it had ended at the tea party, it would have been perfect. Sanji had gotten his dramatic moments with his father and brothers, the Straw Hats had reaffirmed their bonds with Sanji, it seemed like the Big Mom Pirates' goals had been foiled, and the arc had seemingly concluded with a bang. But as it turned out, we were in for a long chase sequence. In my opinion, if you already nail a good ending for a storyline, revealing that that's not the true ending and there's actually a whole other act to go is risky business, because it's just gambling with the goodwill you've built. While there are several important character moments that come out of Whole Cake Island's final act, and Luffy vs. Katakuri was an all-time great fight, at the same time, the chase overall did feel like it dragged for many readers, as Big Mom continued to say wedding cake over and over again for dozens of chapters, as the story rinsed and repeated the process of the Straw Hats nearly getting caught but escaping again and again, and the lengthy Sanji baking a cake plotline may have felt a bit more worth the wait if it had had a longer lasting effect on Big Mom at the end of it all. In defense of Wano, between brilliant moments such as Big Mom's amnesia, the Ice Onies, Kinemon's death, and Hiyori's powerful final words to conclude the arc, it has no real flaws. Much like Whole Cake Island, Egghead is a near masterpiece that fumbles a bit with a dragged out ending. I would argue that the story reaches maximum hype when the Gorosei arrive, but from then on we have this bizarre stretch of storytelling where Vegapunk gives a very long speech, spanning many chapters, and the entire story practically grinds to a halt as we're essentially just cutting all over the island and to outside world characters during the speech, meaning there is very minimal meaningful progression chapter to chapter. And when the speech ends and it seems like it's finally time to get back to the action, the arc's conflict immediately resolves with a plot device. So let me know in the comments below what you feel the biggest weakness of each One Piece arc is, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe. And if you want to hear my thoughts on the 5 One Piece arcs I believe are actually arguably perfect, then you can listen to my weekly podcast that just dropped by becoming a member or by supporting me on Patreon, link in the description below.